So much. Thank you so much, Susan. Just to be sure, so I have 45 minutes basically to present and then 15 minutes of questions. Is that the correct
interpretation? Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So we've got scheduled time until 3 o'clock when people might start to disappear. I don't know, do you want to turn on your camera at all, Alyssa? Or are you
yes, please, yes. Is that something you can do, or do I have to do that?
Let me have a quick look. There we go. Does that work there? Oh, I don't think it's connecting properly, Alyssa. So we might just. Oh, there you go.
Oh yeah, I got it. Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present at the INET seminar. The paper I will be talking about today is called The Great Carbon Arbitrage, which is joint work with Tobias Adrian and Patrick Bolton. And I should say that the views expressed in this presentation are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the views of the IMF, its management, or its directors. Let's see how I move on. Yes. So when it comes to internalizing negative externalities, economists have taken two different approaches. One is associated with PIGU and seeks to fully reflect the social cost of an economic activity by means of taxation. The other is associated with COS and seeks to attain an efficient social outcome through bargaining and contracting. Now, much of the economic literature on climate change has taken a Piguvian approach, seeking to determine the optimal carbon tax as indicated by the social cost of carbon, and then let markets freely respond to that tax. There is by now a sizable literature on integrated assessment models estimating the social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon is a measure of the incremental damage to the world from climate change resulting from additional CO2 emissions. As such, this measure is conditional on the level of CO2 in the air. The higher that level, the more powerful the greenhouse effect, and therefore the higher the expected damages. We build on this literature here by quantifying the social surplus that can be gained from avoiding emissions. We ask, how much could the world benefit? Or in other words, how big is the cohesion bargain of phasing out fossil fuels and replacing them with energy from renewable sources such as solar and wind? In this paper, we focus on quantifying the gain from phasing out coal. The focus on coal is natural, given that it emits roughly twice as much CO2 into the atmosphere as natural gas and roughly 1.5 times as much as oil. On this basis alone, a cost-benefit analysis would indicate that it's most societally and economically efficient to start the energy transition by phasing out coal. Indeed, under a cohesion bargain, coal companies would be compensated for the losses that they incur from ceasing their operations, and the social benefits from avoided emissions would be assessed net of both the opportunity cost of coal and the investment cost needed to build replacement renewable energy capacity. The gross societal benefits of avoiding emissions from coal, capturing both the private economic gains to parties directly involved in the transaction and the external economic gains to parties not directly involved in the transaction, are measured as the social cost of carbon times the quantity of avoided emissions. Indeed, if an efficient global emissions trading system were to be in place, the carbon price in this market would be equal to the social cost of carbon. It would then be possible to reap a gross total revenue equal to the social cost of carbon times the quantity of avoided emissions. Indeed, by going short coal and long renewables, it would then be possible to reap a net gain, or in other words, carbon arbitrage. We find that the gains from phasing out coal are very large indeed. By comparing the present value of the benefits of phasing out coal in line with the schedule of the net zero 2050 scenario of the Network for Greening the Financial System against the cost of the present value of the cost of phasing out coal, capturing both the opportunity cost of coal and the investment cost in replacement renewables, we estimate that the net social gain that can be reaped is around $77.89 trillion. This represents an increase of around 1.2% of GDP every year until the end of 2100. Our baseline estimate, oh yeah, and I should say that we do a lot of sensitivity analysis and consider alternative ranges for the social cost of carbon to show the robustness of our results. So our baseline estimate of the social gain that can be reaped from phasing out coal relies on a social cost of carbon of $75 per ton of CO2, which is in line with the lower end estimates of Leonard et al. And are consistent with the estimate of the IMF. And we also consider different values for the social cost of carbon, ranging from a lower estimate of $64 per ton of CO2 to a higher estimate of $168 per ton of CO2, which are the two sort of the range that the Renner et al. Paper estimates, and that will be used to update the social cost of carbon of the Biden administration, which now sits at $51 per ton of CO2. So it's possible that the carbon arbitrage is much bigger than we identified, and we try to basically take quite conservative values for all our parameters and also for the social cost of carbon. To reiterate, from a cohesion perspective, it is sound economic logic to account for the opportunity cost of coal and as well as the investment cost in renewables, and to assess the social benefits of phasing out coal net of both of these costs. Indeed, it might have been easier to reach a global agreement to end coal at COP26 if compensation had been a more central part of those talks, and if the yet to be fulfilled promise to transfer an amount of 100 billion of climate financing to the developed world every year had been made conditional on the commitment to phase out coal. By making climate financing to phase out coal conditional, you help to ensure macro financial stability, because you basically phase out coal in tandem with phasing in renewables, making sure that the overall energy supply is maintained, and you also avoid a shifting of coal production to, let's say, abroad, which would then not help to lower emissions. So it also helps to actually reap this net social gain. To gain further insight into the size of the transfers that may be required to basically pay for the opportunity cost of coal and the investment cost in renewables, we break down where these costs might be incurred. And we find that the present value of the climate financing needs are around $29 trillion in present value terms. And this is, of course, still a lot, and it's not clear that governments can pay this. So in the policy section, which I'll get to, we propose a public-private partnership where a large part of that funding may be able to be raised from capital markets. And so to conclude, before I get to the main body of my paper, in this paper, we identify a really large net social gain from phasing out coal. And in the light of this large social gain, it makes sense for the world to seek to overcome any obstacles, such as high transaction costs, to cohesion bargaining, which are, if overcome, enable the carbon arbitrage to be reaped. Okay, so let me move on. So in the remainder of this presentation, I'll talk about the data, our methodology, the results, literature, and the discussion, starting with the data. So we make use of a detailed data set by asset resolution and a 2 degrees investment initiative on historical and projected coal production globally. This data set is quite extraordinary because it captures actually plant level data for each unique combination of energy use, coal technology subtype, plant country, and geolocation. It also captures the ownership structure of plants. So we know that there are 2,700 plants companies in the data set, coal companies, of which there are in total 6,090 coal plants. It captures also the emission intensity in tons of CO2 per tons of coal as of 2020, as well as the historical production of each plant up to 2021 and the projected production going forward up to 2026. Now, the emission intensity captures the scope 1, which are the direct emissions incurred in the operations, and the scope 3 emissions, which are the emissions that happen in the value chain of coal mining. And it doesn't capture scope 2 because those are very negligible compared to the other two sources of emissions. And I should emphasize that we are here focusing on coal mining, and we on purpose exclude from our analysis the coal power plants, because that's the emissions that they put into the air are already captured as part of the scope 3 emissions. Now, in this table, we sought to show you that we can probably rely on the 2DI AR data, because both the estimate when we aggregate all the plant production to the global amount of our data, as well as the total emissions, which are obtained by, again, aggregating the production and multiplying the production at each plant with its emission intensity at each plant, give estimates of 2020 global coal production and 2020 global coal emissions that are consistent with the estimates of authoritative bodies such as the International Energy Agency, the Network for Green and Financial System, the BP Statistical Energy Review, and the Global Energy Monitor. And this does not only hold for 2020, which is an odd year because it was COVID-19, but also we checked there are reliable estimates also for 2019 and 2021. Now, we want to basically understand what the sort of the net gain could be from phasing out coal. To do that, we first need to know what would coal production and associated emissions have looked like under a business as usual scenario. So that's what you see in this slide over here, that we're using the scenarios of the Network for Green and Financial System, which have become an industry standard, to basically project outwards, starting from our data that we have, what coal production would have been under a business as usual scenario. That's the blue line. And then what we're also showing you is what might be a feasible pace to phase out coal. And therefore we use the Network for Green and Financial System net zero 2050 scenario, which is the orange line. And as a benchmark, we're also showing you what the reduction in coal production would have been under a nationally determined contribution scenario, which is the type of commitments that countries make under the Paris Agreement. And we also show you what the total reduction in coal production would be if it were to be feasible to phase out coal completely starting from 2024. In practice, we don't think it's feasible to completely halt coal production right away because there are still some industries for which it's not straightforward to replace coal with renewables. But over the upcoming decades, for example, the entire power sector can be largely made to run on renewables, so coal definitely has to be phased out there. And there are also many heavy industry processes that can be electrified. So that's why the net zero 2050 scenario, which is the orange line, shows you that it's probably feasible to phase out coal slowly. And even by 2050, there's still a positive amount of coal production left. So the key thing to realize is that the difference between the blue and the orange line tells you sort of the amount of coal reduction. And what you see on the right plot are the associated reduction in emissions. And because we assume that we only know the 2020 emission intensity of coal plants, and we assume that emission intensity will stay constant over time, you see that the trend is completely sort of the same as for the trend of coal production. So then the other thing that we need to know is what are the investment costs in renewables. And what you see in this picture is that the investment costs in renewables have gone down dramatically over time. And that's what you see in the left plot. And that fall in investment costs has happened concurrently with an increase in the global cumulative installed capacity in renewables. So there's something called Wright's law, which Doan and Lafont have worked on a lot, that basically predicts that the investment costs will fall as a function of the global cumulative installed capacity. So we use the data from IRENA, which is also the data that I plotted here, to get the 2020 investment cost. And then we use, as I will show you in the methodology, the Wright's law to predict how investment costs might fall further over time. Okay, so now let me turn to the methodology. So the carbon arbitrage is given by a positive difference in the present value of the benefits of avoiding emissions from coal production minus the present value of the cost of avoiding such emissions, taking into account both the opportunity cost of coal and investment costs in replacement renewable energy. So that's what you see in equation 1, where T is our current time, capital T is the last date where we phase out, where we make costs to phase out coal. S1 is the business as usual scenario, so that's the S2 is the phase out scenario, so that's the net zero 2050 scenario. SR means with what mixture of renewables will we replace coal, and theta is our social cost of carbon. In this paper, we focus on estimating the global carbon arbitrage. So now let's break down this simple formula of the net benefits of phasing out coal. So the present value of the benefits that can be reaped from reducing emissions is given in equation 2, which basically says that if we sum over both time and over all the coal companies, how much emissions reductions they're able to achieve every year, then we get the global basically reduction in emissions, and we multiply it with the social cost of carbon. This gives us an estimate of the benefits of avoiding coal emissions, because the social cost of carbon, as I said, basically captures the avoided damages from climate change. Note that we take a constant social cost of carbon as a proxy. We think that this is a conservative estimate because in practice, for example, Nordhaus et al. Estimate that the growth in the social cost of carbon is at least 3% in real terms every year. And the discount rate that is normally used to discount sort of costs to invest in mitigation that countries such as the Netherlands and England and also the US and Germany use, it's usually 2%. So, and actually the growth rate in the social cost of carbon may be even higher if we take into account that there may be tipping points beyond which we might experience a climate catastrophe. So by taking a constant social cost of carbon, we're probably estimating a conservative value of the social benefits from phasing out coal. It could be bigger, and I'll show you some sensitivity analysis if we actually allow for a growth rate as well as the discount rate on the benefit side. So the emission reduction that every coal company can achieve is just the difference between its emissions under a business as usual scenario and a phase out scenario, where the emissions under a particular scenario of a coal company are just this, the product of the production that that coal company would have made in each of its plants under that scenario, times the emission intensity of that plant, and then we sum over all the plants of that coal company. So now I explained to you about how we estimate the present value of the benefits. Let's now turn to discussing how we estimate the present value of the costs. So as I said, the cost of phasing out coal consists of both the opportunity costs of coal as well as the investment cost in renewables. So starting with the opportunity cost of coal, this is given by the discounted missed free cash flows of each coal company, where we discount over time and we sort of sum over all the coal companies. That's what's shown in equation 6. Where the missed free cash flow of a coal company is just given by its reduction in coal production, that's equation 7, times the profit that it, or the free cash flow that it makes per unit of coal production. And for this, we take data from Orbis, which allows us to basically look at the historical time series of the free cash flows of every coal company. And we also know the coal production of those coal companies in every year. So we know their per unit basically profit. And we take the median across the coal companies as an estimate of the per unit profit, and we assume that that remains constant over time. That's of course a bit of a simplification, but as I will show you, the opportunity costs of coal are sort of a magnitude or maybe even two, I think, smaller than the social benefits of phasing out coal, as well as the investment cost in renewables. So even if we would, let's say, allow for the profits of coal companies to fluctuate in the future, it would not change our fundamental result. And we think that just taking a constant since predicting how profits might change in the future is a sort of robust assumption that is not speculative. Okay, so how do we discount missed cash flows? We do that with the weighted average cost of capital, which basically says that, which is basically equal to the average leverage of coal companies. And we assume that coal companies are at their target leverage times the risk-free rate. We assume that debt is risk-free, times 1 minus the tax rate, plus 1 minus the leverage times the cost of capital, where the cost of capital is given by cap M, which is again the risk-free rate plus a coal company beta plus the risk premium. And what I show you here is that we use for these values 2.08, that's taken from the 30-year treasury yield, 15% for the tax rate, that's in line with the global minimum tax rate that has been agreed. For the target leverage, we take 52%, that's the leverage of companies that are present in the MSCI Metals and Mining Index. And for the coal company betas, we take 0.9%, which is obtained by regressing the returns of companies in the MSCI Mining Index against the MSCI Global World Index. And for the risk premium, we take the excess CAPE yield from Schiller, and we subtract from that 1% because in line with the study of Dims et al., because basically by holding global MSCI type of index, you can, as an investor, be more diversified. So your risk premium is sort of on average historically, the risk premium of the global index has been about 1% lower than of the S&P 500 index. So this gives us a discount rate under the weighted average cost of capital of 2.8%, but we also conduct sensitivity analysis to show you how our results would change if we take a different discount rate, such as one based on the average risk premium over the last 100 years. Okay, now let's turn to the present value of the investment cost. So to get that, we first look at how much should be invested in every country. So we sum over that, that's equation 9. And then we basically say the present value of the investment cost is of course a discounted value of the investment cost of the investments that have to be made every year. So the annual investment costs in a country, that's equation 10, are just given by how much capacity should be installed of a given renewable of type Q, that's the first term, times the per unit investment cost, so the cost per sort of unit of installed capacity. And then we sum over all the renewable types that will be installed. And again, as I said, the SR subscript basically tells us with what mixture of renewables, so how for every unit of coal do we replace it with 100% solar or 50% solar wind. We can make different assumptions there, that's all fine. So equation 11 is a little bit complicated, so I'll get back to that in a moment. So let's turn to equation 12. So how much renewable capacity of each renewable type Q must be built in year tau in country Y depends on the shortfall of energy created by the phase out of coal, where the shortfall of energy is given by the basically how much fewer energy coal produces because coal is being phased out. So delta P tells us what's the reduction in coal production, and then the G of delta P tells us what is the reduction in energy that is produced because of that reduction in coal production, minus the energy that the existing stock of renewables built explicitly to replace renewables already creates. So the point is that if I build renewables today, they don't only produce energy this year, but they will still also do that for the next 30 years as the solar farm, for example, is in service. So building renewable plants today also helps to further supply energy going forward. So the shortfall is only insofar as the further phase out of coal creates any shortage of energy relative to how much renewables are already built. Now, how much renewables are already built or how much energy that can produce is the sum of how much energy each type of renewables can produce. And how much that can produce is given by the stock of renewables, which is converted with a function h to how much energy that can produce. Again, that's a standard function, times the capacity factor. And the capacity factor captures that renewable plants do not always run at full sort of theoretical capacity, in part because the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, or it doesn't do so at full capacity. So we take standard capacity factors from IRENA. And then the stock of renewable energy capacity of type Q in country Y, which has been built, that is still sort of present at time tau, is given by how much, let's focus on solar for a moment. So it's given by how much solar capacity has been built in the past, starting from the first date at which we started to phase out coal, which is at T+2. We assume that the phase out of coal started in 2024, up to now. And every year there's a certain depreciation rate, dQ of the renewable. And there's also a finite lifetime in which the renewable capacity is sort of functional. So that's the last term, which says that LQ basically means if the capacity has been built longer away in the future, in the past than let's say 30 years, the capacity no longer works. So how much stock we have of solar plants today is basically just the sum of what we've built previously, taking into consideration depreciation as well as a finite lifetime. And here we take some standard depreciation rates that have been estimated by the literature. So now let's turn to the investment cost in renewables. So as I said, over time, the investment costs in renewables have fallen sharply as a function of the global cumulative installed capacity. So what you see in between brackets is basically what is the cumulative global installed capacity to date, which is going to determine what the investment costs are. And the first term says how much has been built up till 2022 in terms of the capacity of, let's say, solar. And then the second term says how much extra solar have we built in previous year as part of our coal phase out. That gives us then the total cumulative installed capacity of solar up to date in our model. And the exponent minus gamma Q tells us what the fall in the investment costs are. So the learning rate gamma Q determines the percentage reduction in investment costs for each doubling of installed capacity. And the alpha Q is just a normalization constant. And we use some standard values in the literature for what these learning rates are. So let me very briefly, by the way, now go back to this formula here. So the amount, this is equation 11, the amount of renewable capacity that we must build every year is then basically equal to the shortfall of energy that we experience in a given year, converted with the inverse function h back to how much energy that, how much stock that corresponds to. We actually have to build more of a certain stock of renewables because the capacity factor FQ is usually smaller than 1. And we then use sort of a way to say from the total amount of stock that we need, what is the amount of that stock that we're going to build with, let's say, solar versus wind. So the weight determines sort of the mixture with which you replace coal. So this is then in our model how the investment costs drop over time. I should say that we probably take a conservative estimate of the drop in investment costs over time, because we only capture learning because of the phase out of coal. We don't capture learning that happens by building, let's say, solar plants for other purposes besides phasing out coal. So now let me turn to the results. So these are the baseline settings that we use for our results. We take a social cost of carbon of $75 per ton of CO2. We look at phasing out coal over the time horizon T+2 to capital T, where capital T is 2100 and T is 2022. We phase out coal according to a phase out scenario of the net zero 2050. We replace coal under our baseline with 50% solar and 50% wind. We assume a 30-year lifetime of renewable plants, where we take into consideration depreciation of installed capacity and a drop in investment costs by learning by doing effects. And we take a median coal profit equal to the top 10 pure coal companies and a discount rate of 2.8%. So this plot here shows you or table here shows you the main result of our paper. It shows that the present value of the benefits of phasing out coal that we estimate under our baseline is $106.9 trillion. And the present value of the cost of phasing out coal, on the other hand, is $29 trillion. And you can see that the lion's share of the costs are incurred by basically building replacement renewable capacity, that's $28 trillion. And only around 50 billion consists of the opportunity cost of coal. So now by subtracting the present value of the cost from the present value of the benefits, we obtain a carbon arbitrage of $77.89 trillion, which represents around 1.2% of GDP. Now, the carbon arbitrage in dollars per ton of CO2 production can then also be expressed, the total carbon arbitrage, which is $77.89 trillion, can also be expressed per ton of coal production, which then gives a carbon arbitrage of $125, or it can be expressed per ton of avoided CO2 emissions, which is then $55 trillion. In total, by phasing out coal under our schedule, total coal production is prevented of 623 gigatons. Total emissions are prevented of around 1,425 gigatons of CO2. And altogether, the reduction in emissions under standard sort of climate temperature sensitivities is then estimated to sort of the prevention in further temperature rise that is then sort of safeguarded is around 2.14 degrees Celsius. So that's to say that it's not only big economic gain by phasing out coal, but it's of course also really important for safeguarding the health of our planet and the biodiversity in there. So the next figure shows you how our estimate of the carbon arbitrage depends on our assumption of the social cost of carbon. You see that our social cost of carbon of $75 per ton of CO2, which we use in our baseline, is quite conservative. It sits closer to the lower estimate of Renner et al. Than to the higher estimate of Renner et al. But the key point that I really want to convey with this plot is that the carbon arbitrage would only disappear if the social cost of carbon is lower than $20.4 per ton of CO2. And most climate scientists would estimate that the social cost of carbon is much higher, potentially even higher than the upper estimate of Renner et al., which is $168 per ton of CO2, when you take into consideration sort of low probability, high impact events, or climate tipping points that kind of then make the damage from additional emissions much worse than it normally is. So now in the next tables, I'm going to show you some sensitivity analysis of around our main result. So I so far showed you the result under the baseline parameters, and now I'm going to show you what if we change each parameter away from its baseline, how would that change the result? So the first thing here is that the carbon arbitrage shrinks if you take into consideration a less long time horizon. That's logical because you will phase out fewer coal. You will therefore obtain smaller social net gains. The second thing we show is what if we could halt coal production completely. That results in a greater carbon arbitrage as expected, but we don't think in practice that's very feasible. And then I'm showing you here, if we rather, for example, replace coal with 56% solar and 44% wind, we obtain a slightly bigger carbon arbitrage. The main reason is that basically by reducing wind in the mixture of renewables, you basically incur fewer investment costs because wind, especially wind offshore, is more expensive than solar. And what I also show you is what if, rather than replacing coal with only renewables, we replace it in part with a transition fuel, natural gas. And you see that that actually dramatically shrinks the carbon arbitrage. And if you would make the gas component the percentage bigger, it may even go negative. And the reason is twofold. Actually, the sort of LCOE of natural gas is higher than that of wind and solar. So it's simply more expensive. And another thing is we don't actually capture learning by doing in natural gas. So there are no further time advantages of getting cheaper costs over time. So we show in the next couple of lines that taking a slightly different assumption on what the per unit coal profit is doesn't really change the result much. Next, we show that if we take a longer lifetime of renewables, for example, we assume that renewables live for 50 years, we get a bigger carbon arbitrage. That's logical because you have to less often replace renewables, so you incur fewer investment costs. And also, if you don't capture learning, obviously the carbon arbitrage is going to be lower because now you don't benefit from the drop in investment cost. And finally, I show you that if we take a different discount rate, changes the result in the expected direction, but again, it's not a huge difference. And here in the footnote, I'm doing a simple exercise where I'm saying, what if actually the growth rate of the social cost of carbon would be around 3% a year, and the discount rate of the sort of that we apply to the benefits of avoiding emissions is 2%, then we get a net growth rate of 1%, which would then make our baseline estimate of the carbon arbitrage grow from 77.89 trillion to 159 trillion. So actually, if it's true that the growth rate in the social cost of carbon is growing, is bigger than the discount rate, and especially if it would also grow non-linear, which is in reality expected, then we may actually substantially still underestimate the carbon arbitrage. So we take, again, a very conservative baseline. So the key point to convey from these two these two tables is that we can change our assumptions, but it doesn't affect the magnitudes of the carbon arbitrage that we affect much, and that we've, for all our parameters, taken quite conservative values. So in fact, carbon arbitrage may be quite a bit bigger than what we estimate under our baseline. Here we do some further sensitivity analysis. I will not go into detail here. So now let's turn to the climate financing. So as I explained, we argue that we should offer conditional climate financing to phase out coal, conditional on the commitment to end coal, and then you need to compensate for the opportunity cost of coal as well as for the investment cost in renewables. And that makes sense sort of from a cohesion perspective. So the present value of the climate financing needs, which you should see in the left bar, are around 29 trillion, and we break that down per by level of development and by region. And you see, for example, that emerging market countries in Asia have the biggest climate financing needs. We then show what the climate financing needs would be over time, and we show that in a non-discounted fashion. And there's a clear visibility of an investment cycle, because you first have to build a lot of renewables to phase out coal, but then whatever you've built will still help to produce energy in the next years. So you only have to build an incremental amount more for the extra coal phase out that you do. And then at the end lifetime of renewables, which we assume to be 30 years, there's again an investment peak. So there's a clear front loading of investment needed, which is in line with the McKinsey 2022 report on net zero 2050. We also show you what the climate financing needs are for every country relative to the country's GDP. And you see that for most countries, it's less than 5% of its GDP. And we see that it's slightly higher for countries that have a lower GDP per capita, and that there are a few countries that are clear outliers whose economies are very heavily reliant on coal production. Here we do some further sensitivity analysis where we show that, for example, on the left plot, how the annual investment needs would change if we, for example, assume a 50-year lifetime. You see that that lengthens the investment cycle, or that we don't allow for learning, in which case you see that the second peak is still as high almost as the first peak, because there's no drop in investment costs. And we also show that if we take an LCOE, which is the levelized cost of energy, as a proxy for the investment cost in renewables, you kind of get the time dynamic of the investments over time wrong. That's shown in the purple line. Okay, so let me quickly move on to the literature. I'm actually going to skip that a little bit, but to focus specifically on the policy section. I think what the key thing that I want to show you in the literature part is that we compared our estimates of the present value of the benefits and cost of phasing out coal against that of the literature. And in particular, we find that the present value of the cost of phasing out coal, which we sort of shows are between $500 billion and $2 trillion, with the front loading for around 3 trillion, is less than the investment costs that are estimated, or sort of the costs that are estimated to decarbonize the energy sector by the International Energy Agency, and are less than the costs that are necessary to decarbonize physical asset and land use systems, as should be expected, which gives us confidence that our estimates are roughly correct. So now let's turn to policy. So in the paper, we identify a big social gain from phasing out coal. So how can we actually reap this net gain? So the global cohesion bargain we propose, in which the opportunity cost of coal and replacement costs in renewables are compensated, results in a Pareto improving deal in which every country in the grand coalition could be made better off. In practice, the cohesion bargain we propose may fail because of high transaction costs. But our point is that in the light of such huge gains from phasing out coal, it makes sense for the world to overcome these hurdles. Here, I'll point out some avenues for how these obstacles can be removed. So as John Kerry has pointed out, the requisite climate financing can most likely not be paid by public funds alone and should be supplemented by private funding. We suggest a public-private partnership model should be pursued to finance the phase out of coal. And the public funding is really helpful because it can both make these investments by capital markets bankable and significantly amplify the total funds that can be attracted for ending coal. So a highly innovative example of how such a public private partnership can be set up is the IMF Amundi securitization deal described in Bolton et al. There, an asset-backed security was constructed where the development institution took the first loss tranche and where the senior tranches had investment grade rating. And the total deal size was about $2 billion. Now, the key point is that 90% of the value of the fund was basically provided by capital markets, and only 10% of money was put in by development banks and government agencies. And they set up a 4-pillar public-private partnership where there was a private concession operator, a government agency, a development bank, and institutional investors. And the development banks really played an important role in making a credit enhancement, basically by investing in the junior tranche. They also helped with their technical know-how and with the monitoring and operation of green projects. So now the question is, how can we apply such a model to the phase out of coal specifically? Now, to finance the phase out of coal in a cohesion coalition, it must be in the interest of 3 key stakeholders to participate in the 4-pillar public-private partnership described before. Governments, coal companies, and investors must be willing to participate. And in this presentation, I'm going to focus on governments. So if we take the IFC Amundi deal as a representative case study, then out of the total climate financing that must be provided, that is $29 trillion, around 10% of the funding must come from public funds, which amounts to around $2.9 trillion. Now, it's in the interest of individual governments to contribute if their gross social benefits are greater than their costs. Now, in our calculations, we basically compute the global social benefit of phasing out coal, and that's a function of the sort of the globally estimated average social cost of carbon, which represents the global average damage of emitting an extra ton of CO2. But of course, in reality, the social cost of carbon is different in different regions because the impacts of climate change will be felt in a heterogeneous way. Some countries will be affected more and others will be affected less. But unfortunately, the science is not as sufficiently advanced to sort of reliably estimate the social cost of carbon for different countries. That's why we took the global average. But our key point is that we find that the carbon arbitrage only disappears if the social cost of carbon would be less than $20 per ton of CO2, using quite conservative baseline parameters. And in fact, if countries would only have to pay around 10% of the total climate financing, the country-specific net social benefits of phasing out coal would only disappear if for that particular country, the social cost of carbon is less than $2 per ton of CO2, which in the bulk of countries would presumably not be true, especially when you also consider that there may be climate tipping points, which would basically eradicate life on Earth or make it much more difficult to live in a fruitful way. So we think that it's actually in the interest of most countries to provide funding to the junior tranche of the asset-backed security. But of course, distributional considerations are really important, especially since the developed world has already emitted a lot more carbon into the atmosphere, and also the developing world may not have sufficient funds, even if it's sort of in their interest to contribute to invest in the junior tranche. So it seems reasonable that the developed world would pay the lion's share of the funding that the developing world would have to provide. And in the paper, I'm not going to go into details here, we kind of explain roughly how much that is, and that it seems quite feasible for the developed world to be able to pay that. I want to make a few more points. So the funding that would be provided to phase out coal is in part grant funding, right? That's the governments that are investing in a junior tranche, but it will also in large part be debt funding because the capital markets would invest and they would expect a return. Now, ideally, the ABS is structured in such a way that it's long-term debt, and because the governments are investing in the junior tranche, the debt would be provided at a low interest rate, which would give the debt a large grant element. And we think that for most countries that are on the receiving end of needing climate financing, that would not increase their debt to GDP levels by more than 5% at most, and there are a few outliers. But of course, for some countries that are heavily reliant on coal, and you could see that in the scatter plot, or countries with a weak existing fiscal position, some debt restructuring or other solution might be necessary. So we argue that the climate financing should be provided conditional on the phase out of coal. And this enables countries to achieve growth in energy demand because you're phasing in renewables that is decoupled from fossil fuels, because it's going to be sort of on the promise that coal will be phased out. And providing conditional climate financing also helps to ensure macro financial stability, as I already explained. And by the way, note that some funding, climate financing indeed is a transfer from one country to the other perhaps, but also countries such as Germany, Australia, the United States, they all have coal production. So the climate financing is also domestic, right? The US needs to get rid of its own coal. So let's turn to the conclusion. So our analysis makes a simple but powerful observation that phasing out coal is not just a matter of urgent necessity to combat climate change, but it's also a considerable source of economic and social gain. From a Gaussian perspective, it is sound economic logic to compensate losses incurred from phasing out coal and to account for capital expenditures to replace energy from coal and link these to the social benefits of avoided emissions. We estimate that the world could realize a net total gain of around 77.89 trillion US dollars, which represents around 1.2% of current world GDP every year until 2100. Indeed, the conditional climate financing needs are very large, around $29 trillion. But our point is that they're nonetheless small relative to the social benefits of phasing out coal, around $106 trillion. So in light of the huge net social gains that we identify from phasing out coal, it is in the interest of the world to seek to overcome any hurdles that prevent the carbon arbitrage from being reaped. And in the policy discussion, we kind of sketched out a roadmap for how these sort of transaction costs might be overcome. But of course, the details of any grand Gaussian bargain in which there will be a grand coalition of countries that partake have to be ironed out in a global deal. I thank you so much for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.